I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the Nissan Navara PRO-4X. The Nissan Navara PRO-4X, this red beast sitting behind me here, is the second Navara from the top of the Australian lineup. Sitting above this vehicle is the Australian sub-engineered Navara Warrior. But the Warrior is another $7,000 on top of the PRO-4X's list price, which is just over 60 grand. So if all you want to spend is this much money, is the PRO-4X a good ute? Well, certainly I think it starts in a good way, because even though this is the same D23 Nissan Navara that we're all pretty familiar with here in Australia now, it's been on the market for several years, I think this facelift is one of the most successful facelifts I've ever seen on any car. Certainly from front on at least, the new Navara or the updated Navara looks a lot more aggressive, and it takes on a bunch of, Americanized cues from the full-size Titan that you can buy in the North American market, but which Nissan don't bring to Australia, though they are saying that they're considering bringing the Titan here in future. For now though, the Navara is as serious as Nissan's commercial vehicles get. There are a couple of engine options, but the PRO-4X is only available with the top one, which is a 2.3 litre twin-turbo 4-cylinder diesel that we'll take a closer look at in just a moment. And as I mentioned, this car is second from the top of the range, but there are a bunch of cheaper dual-cab 4x4 diesel Navaras that you can choose from as well if you don't want to drop this much coin on a ute. But as we'll find out in today's video, the PRO-4X actually does have quite a good array of equipment, and it's pretty decent to drive as well, mainly because, unlike most utes, it has a coil-sprung rear end, which gives it significant advantages in terms of refinement. However, there are also a number of catches, and we'll run through those in today's independent review of the Nissan Navara. But before we get started, make sure to hit subscribe down below the video. First up in this review, let's talk about what's under the bonnet of the Navara PRO-4X and some of the basic specs and capabilities of this vehicle, because they have been bumped with the recent update to the Navara. However, not everything has been improved, including this rather heavy bonnet. No gas struts like we saw on that Great Wall ute the other day. But here you find the best available engine on any Navara. Now, it's only a 2.3 litre 4-cylinder. However, it is twin turbocharged, and the numbers it produces are reasonably competitive: 140 kilowatts of power and 450 newton meters of torque. But now that vehicles like the Toyota HiLux have been bumped up to 150 kilowatts and 500 newton meters, the Navara is starting to feel a little bit left behind. Now, my thoughts on the engine situation with the Navara, particularly now that the vehicle itself looks pretty good, pretty strong and aggressive, is that it would have been so great if Nissan had been able to negotiate with Mercedes-Benz to keep the 3-litre V6 engine for the Navara once Benz decided they didn't want to do the X-Class anymore. I think it's pretty clear by now, though, that Nissan didn't manage to negotiate that, and that's why we've been left with the 2.3 as the top spec engine on this car. And we'll talk about how it gets along when we take the Navara for a drive shortly. However, some of the basic capabilities do sound pretty good. This car is rated for 3.5 ton brake towing, and the payload is actually just over a ton, 1,004 kilos, thanks to a recent update to the rear end of this car. And that's quite useful. Other basics: the ground clearance, unladen at least as it is now, is 220 mils. The weighting depth of the car is 600 mils, and we'll put the approach, breakover and departure angles up on screen here. Next up, let's have a look at the interior. Jumping up here into the cabin of the Navara PRO-4X, you find an interior that's actually pretty good quality, even though the appearance of it is a little bit dated compared to some newer rivals. But we'll come back to the dashboard in a second. First of all, let's talk about what makes this a PRO-4X. Outside, there's all of that black detailing. There's the black 17-inch wheels, the black grille, and that pretty cool black sports bar in the tray. But here inside, it's really about the unique watch strap pattern on these leather seats, which also have PRO-4X detailing on them. Pretty much everything else, though, is fairly standard out of a normal Navara, though you do get a little black and red badge here on this nice small steering wheel, which is basically just lifted from a Nissan X-Trail. So it's a lot smaller than what you get on most dual cab utes, and it helps make this vehicle feel a little bit smaller when you're out on the road. However, while that steering wheel is a good small diameter, there's no reach adjustment in it. So the only thing you can adjust for is rake. So the driving position is a little bit skew-if. Similarly, while the PRO-4X does get these attractive leather seats, they're manually adjustable. And when you're spending 60 grand on a dual cab, I think electric adjustment is the least that you can expect. Now that steering wheel is connected to a dashboard, which is effectively the same as you got when this version of the Navara first came out. However, it has had infotainment upgrades throughout that time. Here in the center, we have an 8-inch touchscreen with a matte finish to it. You get navigation, DAB digital radio, and wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. Now, while the screen assembly looks a little bit dated, actually the software in the screen works perfectly well. It's quite crisp, it's quite responsive to your touch, and even though newer utes like the new BT50 and D-Max have a bigger screen with things like wireless CarPlay, the software on those cars is really bad, whereas at least the integrated software here in the Navara works exactly like you would expect, which is good. Looking ahead though, we have analog gauges with a 7-inch cluster between them. That's full color. You get a pretty cool animation when you turn the car on, and you can get your media and infotainment information in there. So that all works pretty well. And then the way the interior is screwed together is, pretty good. There's not a lot of flex or anything. It feels kind of like a previous generation Nissan in here. So that means a dated look, but generally quite good build quality compared to some rivals. In terms of practicality, we've got 4 USB ports throughout the car, big cup holders, decent door bins, a little bit of oddment storage here ahead of the shifter, but nothing like wireless charging. Oddly though, there's a lot of blanks in this car for such a high spec variant. Perhaps you could do your own auxiliary setup through here. Then we similarly have controls for the transfer case here ahead of the shifter. That's all fairly normal and expected. We've got a 12-volt socket, but where this car does come into its own is actually in the back, where it's a little bit more spacious than some of its rivals, and that's what we're going to check out next. Now, while the Navara is more spacious in the second row than some rivals, particularly there's more legroom than vehicles like the Volkswagen Amarok, like most vehicles in this segment, it isn't the last word in comfort. You still want to be sitting in row 1, that's for sure, but putting friends or apprentices back here is definitely doable, though, I know these vehicles appeal more and more for family transport, but usually that's not what they're actually designed to do, and something like a midsize or large SUV is much more comfortable here in the back. That being said, it's serviceable enough, and impressively, you do get features like rear air vents, and you get another USB port back here, plus an armrest with 2 cup holders, classy faux leather padding on the door as well. So all in all, it's not a bad place to spend time, a short time, that is. While Nissan concentrated most of the resources for this heavy facelift of the Navara at the front end of the vehicle, the rear has also been updated quite considerably. There's new taillight graphics which look quite convincing, but also unusually for a ute facelift, the actual stamping of the tailgate has changed, and we now have the Navara typeface or graphic actually embossed into the metal, and that looks pretty cool. Similarly, we've got some detailing down here on the step to get up into the tailgate. The Pro-4X also comes standard with a tow bar kit already fitted, which I guess is one fewer thing that you'll have to take care of. Now, the tailgate opens with a tiny bit of damping called tailgate assist, but nothing much. But then it opens up to reveal a standard bed liner, so that's already taken care of as well. You'll remember the HiLux SR5 doesn't actually have a bed liner, so that's one area where the Navara is slightly better value at this level. Plus, we've got this pretty heavy duty movable rail system here in the tub itself in order to secure your loads with 4 tie down points. Plus, we have that electric sliding window I pointed out earlier, so if you've got something super long, you can have it pointing into the cabin as well. In terms of measurements back here, the Navara itself is just over 5.3 meters long, so you'll want to check your garage before you buy to make sure you can fit it. As for the tray, it's just over 1500 mil long, but only just over 1100 mil between the arches. So if you want to put something like a pallet in the back of a ute, you'll be preferring options like the Volkswagen Amarok. So what is it going to cost you to run a new Nissan Navara? Well, the warranty on the vehicle is 5 years with unlimited kilometers, so that's a good start. And Nissan also provide cap price servicing for the Navara, though it isn't the most inexpensive in the segment. But the Navara has one nice little trick up its sleeve, and that's that between annual services, it can actually go 20,000 kilometers, whereas most rivals are limited to 15,000 Ks between scheduled maintenance. And those first 5 services, 5 years, 100,000 Ks, will set you back $2,841 for the Nissan Navara. On the insurance front, over the last 12 months, the median budget direct customer spent $1,119 to comprehensively insure a new Nissan Navara. Of course, everybody's situation varies and your premium will vary based on things insurers take into account, like where you live, who drives the car, their driving history, how the car's garaged, etc. And finally, fuel consumption. The 2.3 litre diesel in the Navara is actually one of the more efficient in the class. Nissan claim 8.1 litres per 100 Ks. In our experience, getting somewhere between 9 and 10 litres per 100 is pretty reasonable. So the Navara certainly looks more impressive outside. The cabin is a bit dated, but still probably one of the nicer interiors that you get in this dual cab segment. What's it like to drive? Have they actually changed the driving dynamics of this vehicle? Well, the simple answer to that question is they haven't really. The Navara feels very similar to drive than it did in the previous iteration of the D23, but that iteration was massively upgraded over the earlier Series 1 and Series 2 D23 Navara. So the early versions of this type were not as good to drive, nor were they as suitable for people that need to put heavy weights in the tray than later versions of the Navara. And certainly the facelift carries on those positive changes that were made earlier in this vehicle's lifespan. But we'll come back to those sorts of characteristics in a moment. First of all, let's talk engines. There's 2 flavors of the same 2.3 litre turbo diesel 4-cylinder engine available in Australia with the Navara. The low spec cars get a single turbo version with 120 kilowatts of power, but the higher spec cars, and in fact most Navara trims you can buy, including the Pro-4X, come standard with a twin turbo setup, and they produce 140 kilowatts of power and 450 newton meters of torque, which puts the Navara, I guess, in about the middle of the pack, perhaps slightly under the middle of the pack now for grunt in this segment. When the D23 was released with this 2.3 twin turbo engine, it was quite a bit more powerful and more torquey than rivals like the HiLux. But cars like the HiLux and also the Ranger, which you can still get in a 3.2 or a newer 2 litre twin turbo 4-cylinder, are now more powerful and more torquey than the Navara. But still, the engine itself is okay. In fact, most of the time you're able to just cruise on the plentiful low-end torque of this motor without too much stress. Start putting big loads in the back, using that 1,004 kilo payload, and you are going to notice it though. The more weight you add to the Navara, the less effortless it's going to feel, particularly compared to rivals like the 5-cylinder Ford or the V6 Amarok. And I've already said my piece about how good it would have been if Nissan had been able to secure that Mercedes V6 for the Navara, despite the end of the line for the X-Class, but that didn't happen. Of course, in the previous shape of Navara, you could actually get a Renault-Nissan V6, but I imagine that's an emissions thing, why that didn't stick around. But either way, the 2.3 twin turbo is the best of the lot for the Navara, and it's really perfectly serviceable. The ride and handling in the Navara is actually above average for the class, and when I think of dual cabs that I'd consider buying, the settled, comfortable demeanor of the Navara actually puts this vehicle into contention for me. Now, later iterations of the D23, like this one, have actually benefited from extensive ride and handling tuning in Australia. Early versions didn't as much, but now you'll find that the suspension, the steering, the handling characteristics of the Navara are actually quite well suited to our roads. In particular, that rear suspension setup is quite comfortable for the class, and that's because Nissan have gone for a coil sprung rear end as opposed to the leaf springs that you find in most utes, and so this is a little bit more comfy, a little bit better at traversing complicated bumps on chopped up roads, and we do have plenty of those here in Australia. But even though Nissan reduced the steering ratio for the Navara about 4 years ago now, the steering still does feel quite slow. That's characteristic for the class. None of these vehicles are particularly good to drive, but you do notice the Amarok has a quicker steering rack, feels more like a car from behind the wheel. Occasionally you just find yourself twirling the wheel in a Navara, feeling like you're driving a truck. But ultimately, this car and its rivals are agricultural. They're meant to be basic and durable, and that's pretty much what you get here. But refinement levels are a bit better than most in the class, and to their credit, Nissan have actually packed the Navara full of a lot of new safety tech now. So you get AEB, you get lane keep assist, you get blind spot monitoring, you get a really good 360-degree parking camera that makes a Navara a lot easier to park, particularly if you live in the inner city like I do. Plus, there are a few updates that keep it feeling nice and fresh in the cabin. This screen in between the dials is actually one of the better screens that you can get in the dual cab class. You have a nice trip computer display with a moving compass, lots of information, big touch screen over here. So while the shape of the cabin is a little dated, it actually works quite well. Just a few bizarro points about the Pro-4X. Even though it's presently the top shelf Navara until the Warrior arrives in Australia soon, there's no heated seats, for example, which makes you wonder whether or not it's actually based on the mid-spec Navara ST and not the STX top of the range version, which does have electric seats. And on the STX you can even option a sunroof, but you can't get that on the Pro-4X, and that's a little unusual. So those are my opinions on the 2021 Nissan Navara Pro-4X. Simply put, this is a pretty nice ute for 60 grand plus on-road costs. It's cheaper than high-tier variants with some competitors. The interior is still a fairly nice place to be. The aggressive new design, I think, works really well for this car, and the driving dynamics are really quite acceptable, particularly ride quality, where the Navara has a bit of an advantage over many of its competitors. However, it is important to test drive pretty widely in this segment because it's changing so quickly. Vehicles like the BT50 and new D-Max should be considered, while my personal picks continue to really be the Ford Ranger and the Volkswagen Amarok. That being said, if you're going to have kids in the back of your ute, the Amarok is now pretty dated on the safety front. But I do think the new Nissan Navara, or the updated Navara, is worthy of your consideration, particularly when that new Warrior variant comes out soon. Let me know what you think though. Leave a comment down below this video. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.